Clara pressed Thomas's map against her chest and stepped into the white. The wind hit like a wall. She couldn't see 10 feet ahead. May clung to her back, 4 years old and too cold to make a sound. Clara pulled her coat tight around them both and walked toward where the cliff should be. She had no way of knowing if she was right. She only had the map and what Thomas had told her, and the particular kind of stubbornness that survives when everything else has been taken away. She walked. Thomas Aldridge had been a strong man. The neighbors in the valley all said it. He and Clara had built their homestead log by log over 3 winters on a claim other settlers called too high and too cold to be worth the trouble. And they had made it work. The vegetable garden, the livestock, the root cellar full enough by September that Clara slept soundly for the first time in years. He fell sick in October, a logging axe wound that wouldn't close right. The infection moved fast. By November, he was down to skin and a voice that came and went like a radio between stations. Harlan Doss rode out the 2nd week of November. He came from the territorial capital, well-dressed, soft-handed, with a smile that lived only on his mouth and never made it to his eyes. "I'm sorry to come at a time like this," he said. He produced a document from his coat. "There's the matter of a promissory note your husband signed. First claim on the property if the debt isn't settled by December 15th. Clara looked at the signature. Something cold settled in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. He never mentioned this. Men don't always tell their wives everything, Doss said pleasantly. She looked at him. She looked at the paper. She looked at him again. "Get off my land," she said. He left. But he left in the way of a man who knows exactly when he's coming back. Thomas called her to his bedside 2 days later, before May woke. He was worse. She could see it in his eyes, that particular stillness that comes before the final stillness. He pressed a folded paper into her hands, thick brown paper. She could see he had drawn on it. "The hollow cliff," he said. Each word cost him something. Northeast face of the ridge. When you see 2 boulders, one on top of the other, go behind them. There's an overhang, push through the brush. There's a chamber inside. He stopped, let the air settle back, big enough for a family. She started to ask him how he knew. And Clara, his hand tightened on hers. "Look in the leather fold. Really look. When the time is right." She didn't understand. She tried to ask again. "I love you," Thomas said. He died that evening. Clara sat with him until the tallow candle burned down to nothing. She sent word to the Hargrove family, 4 miles down the valley. No one came back. The sky had turned the color of a bruise, and the first snow started 2 days later. Not the blizzard yet, just the warning of it. Doss returned 5 days after the funeral, with a deputy riding behind him. He stood in the doorway of the cabin with the cold pouring in around him. He looked at her belly. He looked at May behind her skirt. "December 15th is 9 days away, Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "You've got no one to help you and nowhere to go." "That's not a threat. That's just the situation. Get out of my house," Clara said. He left. That night, the real blizzard began. By 2 in the morning, the wind was something she'd never heard before. The logs creaked. The fire fought to stay alive. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping fast, and she had 3 days of firewood at most. May had climbed into her bed and pressed herself against Clara's side. Clara held her and listened to the storm and thought about Thomas's voice. "Look in the leather fold. Really look." She didn't look yet. She was afraid of what she'd find, or what she wouldn't. Before dawn, she made her decision. She took the map. She took the heavy quilt from the bed, the one her mother had made from calico squares the year Clara got married. She wrapped May on her back, buried under the quilt, and opened the cabin door into the white. It took her a long time to find the ridge, longer than it should have. The blizzard had changed the shape of everything. She held the map as close to her face as she could and tried to match Thomas's lines to the landscape she could barely see. She almost missed the two boulders. She walked into them before she saw them, one stacked on the other, exactly as Thomas had drawn them, like a figure looking over its shoulder at something it wasn't ready to face. The overhang was behind them. She ducked under it. There was a wall of brush, dried juniper, brittle and thick, and she pushed through it with her shoulder, her hands too cold to feel much. And then she was inside. A natural chamber in the rock, 20 feet deep, maybe more. Ceiling low near the entrance and rising toward the back, pale limestone walls streaked with rust and dark mineral green. The floor was sand and flat stone. It smelled of cold rock and pine pitch and wood smoke. There was a small fire burning. An old man sat beside it. He was looking at her with eyes so calm he might have been expecting her for some time. "Ma'am," he said. An old woman emerged from deeper in the chamber. She was carrying a tin cup and wearing 3 layers of coat. She looked at Clara, then at May on her back, then at Clara's belly, and she didn't waste a single moment. "Sit down before you fall," she said. She pressed the cup into Clara's hands, hot water with dried pine needles steeped in it. Not much. Everything, the man's name, was Ezra. He was 72 years old and had been trapping in the high country since before Wyoming was a territory. The woman was Ruth, his wife of 48 years, who had spent those same decades learning which plants healed what and how to make a meal out of what most people would call nothing. They had been caught by the blizzard in the high country and had come to this hollow cliff because Ezra had used it twice before in bad winters, decades past. "Your husband," Ezra said, nodding toward the map still in Clara's hand. "He showed you this place?" "He drew the map," Clara said, "before he died." Ezra looked at the map for a long moment. He had the look of a man reading something carefully, the way people read things that have weight to them. "He drew it good," he said quietly. What Clara didn't know yet was that Ezra had been in this hollow cliff one other time, in the winter of 1869, and that he had found something in the rock at the back of the chamber, something he had told no one about, because it hadn't been his to claim, and because the man who was working the valley claim at the time had seemed like someone who would find it himself eventually. That night, with May sleeping against Ruth and the quilt spread over them both, Clara slept for the first time in 9 days. Not long, not peacefully, but she slept. The blizzard lasted 5 days. In those 5 days, Clara learned the rhythms of the hollow cliff. She learned when the fire needed feeding and how much wood to use, not too much, or smoke filled the chamber, not too little, or the cold crept back from the walls before midnight. She learned that Ezra always woke first, before light, and sat by the dying coals with his hands around a cup of hot water and his eyes somewhere else, not asleep, but not entirely in the present either, the way old men sometimes go when they're remembering things that happened before you were born. She learned that Ruth hummed while she worked, always the same fragment of something, never a full song, just 4 or 5 notes repeated like steady breathing. May followed Ruth everywhere. On the second day, Ruth taught her how to grind dried corn between 2 flat stones. On the third day, May was doing it herself, slowly, with the full concentration of a child given a real task who understands it matters. On the second evening, Ezra asked Clara where she'd come from originally. "Ohio," she said. "We came west when May was 2. Long way. Thomas wanted land," she said. Real land, not tenant land. Ezra nodded. He understood that. And he found it. He found it. Ezra looked into the fire a moment. The best men I've known always wanted to leave something that would outlast them, he said. Most of them managed it, just not always the way they planned. Clara didn't answer. She looked at the map in her hands instead. Thomas's map stayed in her coat pocket through the days and came out each evening by firelight. She studied his lines, the ridge, the trail markers, the careful notations at each landmark. He had also drawn, in the northeast corner, a small mark she hadn't noticed at first, an X inside a circle inside a square. She asked Ezra what it meant. He looked at it for a long moment. Mining survey mark, he said. Someone had their eye on this ridge. He said it carefully and left it there. Thomas's map stayed in Clara's coat pocket. She took it out every evening by firelight and looked at it. At his lines. At the way he had drawn the mountains with short strokes, the way she had seen him draw everything, efficiently, no wasted marks, every line doing its work. He had also drawn, in the northeast corner of the map, something she hadn't paid attention to at first. A small mark, an X inside a circle, inside a square. She didn't know what it meant. She also hadn't looked in the leather fold. Not yet. Her mother's calico quilt had been draped over the ledge that served as a sleeping surface. Every night she refolded it and laid it back. It was the only soft thing in the hollow, and it smelled faintly of the cedar chest where her mother had kept it. And that smell was its own kind of company. On the evening of the third day, she broke. It came without warning, the way grief does when it's been held back long enough. She was folding the quilt, and her hands stopped, and she sat down on the stone floor and pressed her forehead against the calico and didn't make a sound. Didn't want to scare May, didn't want Ruth to think she was falling apart, didn't want Ezra to look at her with pity. Ruth came and sat beside her. She didn't say anything. She just put one hand on Clara's back and kept it there, steady, until the shaking stopped. "He left you what he could," Ruth said finally. "That's what good men do." Clara wiped her face on the quilting and got up. In the morning she made saltwater mush from Ruth's cornmeal and fed it to May and to herself. And when May asked where they were going to live now, Clara said, "Home, we're going home." She didn't know yet whether that was true. But she said it, and May nodded like it was the most sensible thing she'd ever heard. Ezra mentioned Doss on the fourth day. He said it carefully, in the way of someone who has thought about whether to say it. "There's a man been asking around about this ridge," he said, "before the storm. Asking the Hargroves, asking at the feed store, asking what's up in the high country above the Aldridge claim." Clara looked at him. "What kind of man?" "The kind that asks about other people's land," Ezra said, without saying why. God willing, Clara thought, the snow would let up before Doss came back, and when it did, she would be ready. She just didn't know yet what she'd be ready with. But inside the leather fold of Thomas's map, something had been waiting since the day he drew it. The storm broke on the fifth morning. Clara woke to quiet, real quiet, not the buried quiet of the blizzard, but the clean, open quiet of a world that had finally settled. Pale light came in around the brush at the entrance. She could hear birds. She took the map out of her coat pocket. She looked at the leather fold along the top edge. Thomas had stitched it himself. She could see the thread, the same careful short stitches he used on everything he made. She ran her thumb along the fold. There was something inside it, a stiffness that wasn't the paper itself. She pulled the stitching open with her fingernail, slowly. It came apart easily. He'd left it loose on purpose. Inside the fold, folded again to fit, was a second document. She opened it. It was a certificate of mineral claim, filed at the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, Wyoming, dated March 1879. In the names of Thomas Aldridge and Clara Aldridge, joint claimants. A silver-bearing formation on the northeast face of the ridge above the Aldridge homestead, with coordinates, a surveyor's description, and the notary's seal across the bottom corner. And below the seal, in a second hand, assessed value, preliminary estimate, $14,000 to $22,000. Clara sat very still. She read it twice. Then she looked at the X inside the circle inside the square in the corner of the map and understood what it meant. He had found the silver. He had found it in the first winter, when he had climbed the northeast face alone. She remembered him coming home that evening with his coat full of rock samples, and that particular look he had when he was turning something over in his mind. She hadn't known what he'd found. He hadn't told her yet. And then life had gone on, and winter had turned to spring, and the samples had gone into the box on the shelf, and she had forgotten about them. He hadn't forgotten. He had filed the claim quietly, in both their names, and said nothing, and waited. Ezra had come to stand beside her. She held the certificate out without a word. He read it slowly, all the way through, the way a careful man reads something important. That's why Doss wants the land, he said. He knew, Clara said. Or suspected. A man like Doss doesn't invent a debt unless he wants the property badly enough to lie for it. Ezra looked at the certificate again. This was filed in 1879. Doss's note is dated October 1882. The same month Thomas got sick. He waited until Thomas couldn't fight him. Yes, Ezra said. He did. Clara read the date one more time. March 1879. 3 years before Doss had ever ridden up the valley trail. The note is worthless, Ezra said. This certificate establishes prior claim on the mineral rights and the land both. Any territorial judge would say so in 2 minutes. Ruth, who had been listening from the far end of the chamber, crossed the floor and said quietly what was true. He knew you'd need it, she said. That's why he hid it where you'd have to look. Clara folded the certificate back into the map's leather fold, carefully along the original creases. She held the map against her chest with both hands, the same way she had held it walking through the blizzard. The same way she would always hold it now. He had known about the silver. He had known Doss would come. He had known he wasn't going to be there to stop it. So he had done the only thing still in his power. He had hidden the proof where she alone would find it, and trusted her to look when she was ready. Doss arrived the next afternoon. He came with a deputy, and a third man Clara didn't recognize, someone with a surveyor's equipment case on his saddle. He came through the snow on the valley trail with the unhurried confidence of a man who has already decided that the outcome is settled. Clara met them at the property line. Ezra stood beside her. Ruth was at the cabin with May. Doss pulled up and looked at Clara. Then at Ezra. Then at the hollow cliff above them on the ridge. Mrs. Aldridge, he said. The 15th has passed. It has, Clara said. Then we have business to conclude. We do, Clara said. But not the business you came for. She drew the mineral claim certificate from her coat. She had wrapped it in oilcloth overnight to protect it. She held it out. Doss didn't take it. He looked at it. That document, said Ezra, in the voice of a man who has lived too long and seen too much to bother raising it, was filed at the Territorial Land Office in March of 1879, 3 years before the note you're carrying. The mineral claim supersedes the promissory note in territorial law. You're welcome to take it to a judge. I believe you already know what a judge will say. Doss looked at the certificate. He looked at his deputy. Something passed across his face that wasn't quite a feeling. It was the calculation of a man deciding whether to hold or fold. The third man, the one with the surveyor's case, had already stopped his horse and was looking at the ridge. "The land is mine," Clara said. She didn't say it loud. She said it the way you say a true thing. "Thomas registered the claim before you ever wrote that note. You knew that when you rode out here in November. You knew it when you stood in my house and told me I had nowhere to go." Doss held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the valley trail. The deputy followed. The third man hesitated, looked at the ridge one more time, and then followed too. Ezra watched them go. "He won't try again," Ezra said. "No," Clara agreed. "He won't." She stood at the property line until the 3 horses disappeared around the bend. Then she turned and looked at the homestead, the cabin, the livestock shed, the snow-covered ground where the garden would come back in April. She breathed. When spring came to the valley, it came all at once, the way it does in high country, not gradually but in a decision, as though the mountain had finally made up its mind. The snow pulled back from the south, facing slope first. Within a week, the garden beds were showing black earth, and the creek was running hard with snowmelt, and the sound of it came through the cabin walls from first light to last, steady and clean. The sound of things moving again. Clara's daughter was born in late March, in the homestead cabin, with Ruth's steady hands and the first warm wind of the year coming in through the cracked window. They named her Eliza. She was loud and red-faced and healthy in every way that mattered. Ruth cut the cord and wrapped her in the calico quilt, the one Clara's mother had made, and held her up in the firelight. May took one look at Eliza and decided she was in charge of her. Ezra and Ruth didn't leave the valley. They had nowhere particular to be, they said, and the winter had reminded them they were getting on in years. They built a small cabin on the ridge trail, 2 hours' walk from the homestead. Close enough to be neighbors, far enough to be themselves. In the evenings, when the air was mild enough, Ezra would come down and sit on the step with a cup of coffee and say nothing much at all, which was a kind of company Clara had come to value more than she could explain. Thomas's map hung on the wall above the fireplace, in a pine frame Ezra had made one Sunday afternoon without being asked. The certificate of mineral claim was still folded inside the leather fold. Clara had kept it there. She didn't need it on display. She knew what it said, and she knew what it meant. And she knew that Thomas had put it where he had put it for exactly the reason Ruth had named in the hollow cliff. He knew she'd need it. He had trusted her to look. The calico quilt lived folded on the chair by the fire. May had stopped claiming it as her own sometime in April, once Eliza had made clear it was hers. On a warm evening in late April, Ezra sat on the step looking at the map through the open door. He was a careful man, he said. Yes, Clara said. She was sitting in the doorway with Eliza, watching the ridge turn pink in the last light. Careful men are rare, Ezra said. They are. Ezra looked at the map a moment longer. He knew what he had, Ezra said. The land and the woman both. Clara didn't answer. She watched the last of the light leave the ridge, and the first stars come on, and the creek run on in the dark below the meadow, steady and sure, the way it would run long after all of them were gone. God had put Thomas in the world for 36 years, and in those years he had been a careful man. And the most careful thing he had ever done was to make sure that she could survive without him. Clara didn't understand it fully until the first day of spring, when she planted the first seed in the first bed and felt the earth give under her hands, soft and ready, and understood that this was the answer to every question she had carried through the blizzard. Sometimes the most important things in life don't find us. when we're ready. They find us when we're walking through the worst storm we've ever seen, with a hand-drawn map pressed against our chest, putting one foot in front of the other because someone who loved us trusted us to keep going. Has anyone ever believed in you just when you were starting to doubt your own worth? If this story stayed with you, leave us a comment below. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Share this with someone who is carrying something heavy right now, someone who needs to be reminded that the map is already in their hands. Until the next story. And they say in that valley that if you climb the northeast face of the ridge on a clear day, you can still see the mouth of the hollow cliff above the overhang, just beyond the two boulders, one stacked on top of the other, like a figure looking back over its shoulder at something it was finally ready to face.